Everyone, happy Friday. It's Insta Live on Fry. It is Audrey Button, college specialist at Safe Harbors of the Finger Lakes. I use the pronoun she, her, hers, and I'm here today to talk to you about digital consent. So it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and also a reminder it's Child Abuse Prevention Month. So for this day, we'll be talking about specifically digital consent. I know last time we went over rape culture, and then we have a couple other topics planned for the next couple Fridays for the rest of this month, so make sure you check those out. So just before we get going, I always like to give a content warning. Some of the material I'll be discussing may be sensitive to some, so please take care of yourself however you need to. This video is recorded, so it will be available afterwards on our Instagram page and our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it later, then you can do that. And then also just a quick disclaimer, the views and opinions expressed in this video are not necessarily those of Safe Harbors of the Finger Lakes, but of those in the video. So we'll go ahead and get started in talking about digital consent, which might be kind of new to you. It definitely is more recognized now in the day and age of COVID and also just being online more. So before we talk about digital consent specifically, I'm just going to go over consent in general because it's really similar. There's obviously some slight differences, which we'll talk about in a second. So what's consent? I know we've talked about it before. It might have been a while, but consent, just a really great definition, and some things it must include, it's an agreement between participants to engage in a sexual activity. And not always. Consent could be anything, not even sexual. It could be like, can I borrow your pen? Is it okay if we just hang out later? Like, it doesn't have to be sexual in any ways, but obviously it's important to have when participating in a sexual activity of any sort. Consent needs to be clearly and freely communicated between all parties, and consent cannot be given if someone's under the age of consent. So in New York State, that's under the age of 18 years old. They cannot be intoxicated or incapacitated in any way by drugs and or alcohol. They cannot be asleep or unconscious. Any of those things, you cannot give consent, so therefore you do not have consent. If someone is being pressured or intimidated or threatened or coerced in any way, that is not consent either. At that point, it's not freely given, like we've discussed before. And then it's also not consent if there tends to be like unequal power dynamics and that person's using that power maybe to possibly, get that consent in a different ways. That also means consent has not been freely given in that way. So, the big thing with consent, it's just about active communication between all parties at all times and just respecting each other's boundaries. And things to also keep in mind about consent, past consent does not mean current consent. Even if you're in a relationship or you have been seeing each other, past consent does not mean current consent. You always need to get consent no matter what. You can change your mind at any time. So, respect that, that person might change their mind. Maybe they said it was okay at first and then they changed their mind, or maybe they said something that was okay, else was okay that you were planning on doing, and then they changed their mind, but they were okay with other stuff. People can change their mind. It's okay, and you should respect that. And consent, it needs to be enthusiastic. I know that sounds a little silly, but it does. An absence of a no does not mean consent. Just because they didn't say no does not mean consent. And I'll repeat that. Even if there's a clear yes, you should definitely make sure it's a yes, like a clear yes, enthusiastic yes, because you need to pay attention to those verbal and nonverbal cues. How does their tone of voice sound? How does their face look? Are they really tensed up? Do they look uncomfortable? Do they look nervous? Like, just being aware of how they're reacting. And it's not going to hurt to constantly check in and be like, are you sure you want to do this? It's okay if we don't, making them feel comfortable and having that open communication. So it needs to be enthusiastic. And, always, always, always get consent for everything, every single time. Is it okay if I hold your hand? Is it okay if I hug you? Is it okay if I sit right next to you? Is it okay if you come over later? Is it okay if I go over later? Every single time. It seems silly, but that way you both feel comfortable and safe. And because you want that in a relationship, whether that's a sexual, intimate, or any sort of relationship, you want every person to feel comfortable and safe. So with, consent, just because you have consent for one activity does not mean consent for another activity. So like I said, maybe they're okay with holding your hand. That does not mean you get to hug them. You should be asking them if that's okay to hug as well, because maybe they're okay with just holding hands and they're not okay with hugging. So just keeping that in mind, you always need to ask. So consent can, everyone acts like it's so complicated. It really isn't. It's just that constant communication, because we want both people to feel safe and happy and, loved in that relationship. And so with digital consent, that's the same thing as consent. It's just a way to refer to consent that happens through screens. So electronics of any sort. So you see texting, social media, dating apps, online gaming, anything that happens through a screen of any sort. So it doesn't necessarily be a phone, it could be a computer, it could be a tablet, anything, game consoles, anything that happens through a screen or digital of any way. So keep in mind, we just talked about consent. That's just, getting consent online or through digital means. So ways we can practice digital consent can include, asking permission before, and I like to emphasize before, sending explicit messages or pictures or images or videos and or texts to that person. Is it okay if I send a picture of myself to you? And if they say no, you should respect that. Respect others' decisions once you ask for consent to do that thing. Because maybe they would be really uncomfortable if you send that unannounced or just, something that's going to make them extremely uncomfortable. You don't want to make them uncomfortable. And, do not threaten, intimidate, pressure, and so forth. Like we talked about, someone, even if after they told you no, they're not sure or just didn't give you that enthusiastic yes, because that's not okay either. You want to make sure everyone's comfortable in the relationship because, especially if you love and respect one another, that's definitely really important. And understand people's digital boundaries. Everyone might have different boundaries for in-person versus online, and even meeting in-person boundaries. So maybe you have relationships online, you really want to meet them in person, but maybe the other person isn't comfortable with that. So it's important to have that constant communication. And if you choose to meet in person, setting those boundaries and having that communication beforehand, and before you do anything, you're getting that consent every time. Even with like tagging people on stuff on social media, sharing things with them on social media, anything like that, or even if you're in a relationship, putting your relationship status on social media or posting pictures about each other, you'll need to get consent for that too, because some people might have some certain digital boundaries, with that kind of stuff. So that was kind of an overview of, consent, especially digital consent, because with COVID, everyone's been kind of stuck at home. Everyone's been doing everything online. We're all on video platforms of some sort. So like Zoom, I don't even know, WebEx, there's all these different ones. But we're all online trying to stay connected with one another, or a lot of people have been having a hard time with dating or like having relationships. So they've been turning to online platforms to do that. You still need consent even if it's online. So keeping that in mind, as we, in this day and age of being online and with COVID, you always need to get consent, even if it's online. So thank you all so much for tuning in this week. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Make sure you check out our topics for the rest of the month of April. Why I can't even talk. Because we'll have Sexual Assault Awareness Month focused topics for the rest of April. And that is it. So thank you so much. Have a great weekend.